Hi everyone, and welcome to Completing the Circle Towards a Circular Economy. We'll be collecting questions throughout the session to the Q&A box, and if we aren't able to get to them at the end of the session, we'll do our best to answer them in writing and share them on the website after the teach-in. I'm Natasha Ballwit from Architecture 2030, and it's my pleasure to introduce the speaker for this session, Richard Boyd. With a background in building engineering, Richard joined Arup's multidisciplinary design studio, Arup Associates, in 2011. After 4 years of building design and construction experience in the UK, Middle East, and South Asia, his focus on embodied carbon led him to specialize in environmental impacts of construction products and supply chains. This work includes completing GHG emission calculations for products, construction projects, cities, and economic sectors, comparative sustainability studies for construction supply chain businesses, the design and implementation of carbon management processes, and the use of circular economy principles as a set of tools and an inspiration for reducing the emissions impact of the building sector. Thank you, Richard. You can go ahead and share your screen.
Great. Thank you, Natasha. And good morning or good afternoon, everyone, where I guess it's afternoon for you guys. I'm based in London, so it's just coming up to midday for me. But I'm very happy to be about to spend sort of a bit of time, 35 minutes, 45 minutes or so with you to run through some of the work that I've been doing with Arup on applying circular economy principles to the built environment. The presentation is going to come in two halves. The first half, I'm going to talk a little bit about a vision for a circular built environment, trying to sort of be a bit specific about what we mean when we say a built environment operating on circular economy principles. And the second half, I'm going to share a bit of the work that we've done on considering what the business case for applying circular economy in the built environment for real estate investors and construction clients specifically. So I'll just stress that in the second half. I can hear myself on a bit of a lag, so maybe if there's someone on the call who can mute themselves, that would be super useful. To start off though, I'd like to find out who I'm speaking to. So the first thing that I want to do is run a quick poll. Natasha, if you can bring up the first two questions. Just to find out a little bit about which parts of the value chain you think of yourself being in. So there's a sort of a series of groups there just on the screen, and depending on what your role is, your primary role is, if you just let us know. And also then there's a question here about sort of in what areas do you think the idea of a circular economy as you understand it right now, in what areas of built environment activity do you think it is relevant? And we'll give you all a couple of maybe 10 or 20 more seconds. Natasha can keep an eye on how many people have done it. We'll try and get up to close to everybody, if not everybody having responded, if we can. I mean, this perspective is useful for us because depending on where you sit in the built environment value chain, circular economy will mean really quite different things to you and to different people. So maybe we can have a look at the results now, Natasha. Great. Okay, so we have a good cross section. We've got an investor, a planner, an academic, a couple of academics, a few policymakers, but predominantly designers, and that's really interesting. No clients, that's interesting. So yeah, so principally, I guess, similar, Arup is a design organization. We started our journey at looking at circular economy from a design perspective, which will chime with lots of you, but we can also see that there are a couple of other perspectives that we're trying to bring into our work here as well. And in terms of where it goes, everyone thinks it's relevant for design. That's great. Sort of 50% or just under 50% think it's relevant to the other areas. I mean, again, our definition, the way that we look at circular economy, we think of it as a systemic response. And so it's a bit of a trick question. I apologize. We are starting to think or starting to see that it has application to all of those 5 areas of built environment activity at some level or some scale. And I'll hopefully by the end of the session, I will have explained or given some flavor as to why I think that, and you'll be able to share that perspective with me. So if I move on to my next slide. I kind of mentioned Arup's journey on circular economy. It's been going on for just over a decade now. As I said, we started coming at it from a very design focused, a material focused lens, but increasingly we're starting to look at the business and the planning elements of it as well. I think the only thing that I'll sort of highlight out of this timeline is that in the middle there in June 2016, you can see that Arup became the global knowledge partner for the built environment of the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, one of the world's most influential advocates of circular economy. And that partnership has generated the work that I'm going to talk about today has been a joint effort between Arup and the Ellen MacArthur Foundation to examine what this means for this sector. That partnership work, plus other work that Arup has been doing, has kind of created a significant literature across different scales, material scales, asset scales, systemic scales, all exploring what circular economy means for the built environment, for product design, for building design and infrastructure design, but also city planning, and more sort of economy-wide policy making, and also what it means for businesses. So this is, again, talking a little bit about where my perspectives are coming from. So our starting point, again, is sort of thinking about when we look at a construction site today, it sometimes is quite challenging to imagine how perhaps the more idealized version of the circular economy will actually work in practice. We understand the principles of circular economy, and I'll address those on the next slide. But when we sort of think about everyday built environment practices, it's sometimes difficult to see how things are actually going to change. What is it that we're actually going to do differently? And the work that we've been doing with the foundation has been to try to explicitly address this point. What are the practical everyday changes that we can make in our work? The principles that I mentioned, we use the principles that are defined by the Ellen MacArthur Foundation for what circular economy is. Circular economy is an economy that designs out waste and pollution. It's an economy that keeps products and materials in use at their highest possible value for as long as possible. And it's an economy that, by achieving the first two things, also means that we regenerate the damaged natural systems that we all rely on for global planetary health and global human health. So these are our three starting principles. But when we apply those to the built environment is very particular in its scale, the length, the scales to which it operates, the longevity of its assets, these kind of things, very different to other economic sectors. So we felt like there had to be a specific built environment specific translation of those principles. So for one of our early publications with the foundation, we called First Steps Towards a Circular Built Environment, we created this vision for what a circular built environment would look like. There are 8 elements to it, split into 2 groups of 4. The top 4 are kind of systemic and cross-cutting, and I'll run through each of these in turn. The bottom 4 may be more specific to different asset types or different scales. And again, I'll run through each of those 4 in this first half. So the starting point for this whole conversation is that if we are going to change how the economy works and how it uses materials and value, we can't lose sight of the fact that it also has to make sure that both human and natural well-being is improved. That is core and central to what we are trying to do. And there's no point achieving a circular economy and reducing emissions if it also, in that process, reduces living standards or creates environmental damage. So we must keep that at the heart of everything that we do at all times. We also need to think about systemically, and this is perhaps a little bit abstract, but I'll mention 2 ways in which this may be a little bit practical. Coming from a building design background, one way about thinking about systems thinking is what happens beyond the red line of my building. So I make a lot of decisions about the design of my building. All of those decisions have impacts on the communities around that building outside the red line, on the supply chains providing materials to that building outside the red line, on the energy and water and infrastructure systems that supply that building also outside the red line. So to think about systems thinking, we do have to sort of consider what the consequences of some of our decisions would be beyond the direct and immediate scope of our project. And that to understand what those consequences are, we need data. And increasingly, smart cities are giving us the data. Smart supply chains, things like blockchain, these technologies are giving us the data that we need to sort of provide us with the feedback. We need to know what those consequences are and supports the systemic thinking that we need to undertake. That relates very closely then to holistic urban planning. Our planning colleagues are designing new neighborhoods, planning new neighborhoods in some countries, designing whole new cities. And the shape and structure of those cities determine the consumption patterns within those cities. They also determine the longevity of our assets. Planning rules, if they change, can really drive a development round that leads to a lot of demolition and premature demolition of assets. So holistic urban planning has to think across, is the process by which we manage the trade-offs between development, human well-being, natural well-being, resource consumption, those kind of things in the economy. And of course, as I've mentioned, if we're going to do new things, if we're going to do things differently to the way we did them before, acknowledging that there was good sense and it made sense to do them in the way that we did them before, then we need new capabilities and new technology, and the digital technology that we're seeing sort of rapidly changing a lot of what we're doing gives us the opportunity to manage materials differently, get materials into material loops, get buildings operating more intensively and these kind of things. And I'll give more specific examples of those as I go through. Thinking more tangibly at a lower level, of course, the starting point for a lot of circular economy discussion is the discussion on continuous material cycles. And so ultimately, this is what we're really trying to, if we achieve this, then we will achieve a lot of our other objectives around waste elimination and decarbonisation. So we need to think here not just about design and material specification, but also procurement and business models. We need to buy resources or services from the supply chain in such a way that it makes it almost a legal or contractual obligation that those suppliers take those materials back and reuse them and resupply them to other people when we don't need them anymore. The product of real estate is space. The product of construction are walls and floors and things. So as well as thinking about how effectively and efficiently we use walls and floors and the material that goes into those, we also need to think about how efficiently and effectively we use space. And this is where the real estate lens that I'm going to talk about in the second half of this presentation comes in. So if we think about space, we need to think about using that space as productively and flexibly and adaptably as possible. And I'll share later what I really mean when I say flexible and adaptable. All buildings are predictions, and all predictions are wrong. That's what Stuart Brand, the author of How Buildings Learn, said back in the 90s. Inevitably, no matter how carefully we design them, social expectations will change, neighborhoods will change, buildings will need to be removed rather than demolished. And so we need to design all buildings for maintenance and deconstruction. And finally, I mentioned that buildings sort of receive and are supported by infrastructure systems, currently designed typically in silos across transport modes, energy, waste, water, communications. If we're trying to think about these things slightly more integrated way, we can achieve real efficiencies. One example is in water. Traditional grey, heavy infrastructure solutions can deal with changing flood risks, increasing flood risks associated with climate change in a very expensive and resource intensive way. More distributed, circular models leveraged by digital technology might identify 1,000 small interventions in a catchment that would have the same flood alleviation effect that one large concrete solution might, delivering the same impact on a much lower cost base and much lower resource footprint. So these are the kind of infrastructure systems that we are thinking about. So that was a bit of a quick whistle-stop tour around a little bit of what a circular economy would look like in the built environment at different scales and in different ways. And I just wanted to pause at that point again before going into the second half to ask you, to what extent do you see any element, any of the 8 elements already in play on your projects? And do you see a business case for action around changing your practices towards adopting these elements of this vision? Just as a reminder, the 8 elements that we talked about were sort of improving human and natural well-being, using systems thinking, holistic urban planning, and leveraged by digital technology. Those are the 4 across the top that might apply to all projects. And then continuous material cycles, flexible productive buildings, the buildings designed for deconstruction and maintenance, and integrated infrastructure systems were the 4 that may or may not have different levels of relevance at different scales.
Here we can see the results.
So that's great to see that more than half of you are seeing it more than half your projects to some degree, which shows a good level of take up or consideration or penetration of these circular economy ideas into the market in this region, which is really good. A couple of people seeing it not at all or seeing it's a bit new, so that's sort of an opportunity to engage new audiences, engage new people in this discussion, and see whether there are value propositions. And I'm going to talk in the second half about what some of those value propositions might be. So if we quickly
go ahead now and launch the next poll quickly.
Yeah. So again, this question was sort of, given we have this vision, do you see or are you aware of a positive business case for adopting some of these elements of a vision or some of these circular economy principles into the work that you're doing? And that might be you've heard other people speak about it, or you've got direct experience of it, or you have a sense, an intuition, a notion that the information is useful and the business case is strong. It's been articulated clearly.
I think this must be an easier question.
Yeah, trying to get, it's a bit mean to get people to remember the 8 elements, I think, off the top of their head, having just introduced them. So if we bring up the results for that, if we've got over half.
All right, I'll go ahead and share these results.
Okay, and again, that's interesting, sort of pretty spread, that it's pretty clear to some people and they're seeing it happen. But for others, it's still a little bit new, a little bit fresh, or they could strengthen it a little bit. And that's fine. That's what we see quite a lot in our market here in London, and with colleagues in North America and colleagues in Australia and East Asia as well. So yeah, that's interesting. Hopefully then the second half of this presentation will sort of start to address some of those points for those in the disagree group. So the next piece that I wanted to talk about, so the second half of this project, from principles to practices, working with the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, having developed the vision, it also identified construction clients and investors as the key parts of the value chain who could take those first steps towards getting circular economy going on projects. But it also identified that they could identify significant barriers to implementing these principles, and didn't necessarily have a very clear idea on the business case. That they would have been in that disagree category at this point. So we designed the second half of the project around using data from real projects. We got 5 real projects from 5 different European cities, different sectors of the economy, to provide us their confidential commercial data. And we've produced a couple of business models that use circular economy principles to deliver improved outcomes for them. And the starting point for identifying those improved economic returns was to identify where value is lost. And at the moment, the linear system is excellently optimized to maximize value to a degree for some value chain participants, but there is value still that's been left on the table or is falling down between the gaps between some of the value chain operators. And the first of those is underutilized space. Even before a global pandemic and COVID and everyone working from home, we saw that in Europe, 35 to 40% of offices were underutilized or underoccupied. And so the space that we had built at great expense and with great environmental impact was not being used particularly well. So we can use that space better. We're also seeing, we notionally design most buildings to last 60 years. That doesn't necessarily mean a huge amount, because different parts of buildings last different lengths of time. And no building sort of is particularly considered to be sort of worthless or fit for demolition bang on 60 years. But we do see buildings being prematurely demolished. So buildings that could last a lot longer, they still do have value for reasons of economics or social expectation. They're demolished after 20 years or 15 years or 25 years. So a lot earlier than we would expect them to. We also see, even in quite high land value cities, vacant land being left and unused. And this is a real challenge around planning and economics and politics even. But trying to bring vacant land into use to provide amenity to local communities is clearly an area where value is currently being lost. The circular economy is all about keeping materials at their highest possible value for as long as possible. Accountancy practices take a different view. They assume that materials depreciate sometimes linearly to a 0 value after their sort of service life. And firms that own these assets kind of consider them to have 0 value at the end of that period. And so the way that we depreciate materials on balance sheets and use accountancy rules to manage that is something that is pretty important for us to address. And also the buildings that we design don't often perform as well as they could. And that also leads to environmental impacts that could be avoided. And so we want to be able to change the way that we do things so that buildings do actually design the way that we want them to. So 5 areas of lost value. And we've designed 5 areas of 5 business models based on circular economy principles that real estate investors and construction clients could start to adopt that capture the value associated with those 5 areas of waste. They're flexible spaces, adaptable assets, relocatable buildings, residual value, and performance procurement. I'm going to run through how each of these 5 models would work and the beneficial economic cases that sit behind each of them. So as mentioned, even in what would be ostensibly a fully tenanted, fully leased building, we have empty space, underoccupied space. Anchor tenants are not able to fully occupy their spaces sometimes. Yet there is a demand for more space. There was a demand for more space that sort of particularly shorter term, more flexible office users wanted to come in and use that space. So our value added here is to fully occupy a building that otherwise wouldn't be fully occupied. The existing stakeholders are the landlord and the anchor tenant. And what our model does is it proposes a new flexible space operator, somebody sitting somewhere between an existing flexible office operator like a WeWork, but it's bringing it's a blend of that sort of higher risk flexible office space operator type thing with existing sort of medium term lease anchor tenant type arrangements. And it's saying on the top of my anchor tenant, on the top of my lease, how am I able to manage the advertising of this, the security of this, the access to this space in a way that generates additional revenues for the landlord or the anchor tenant, or split between them in a way that maximizes the use of that building. And these flexible spaces also are flexible. We take this to mean flexible across 24 hours and 7 days. So we're thinking there's the question of doing this during office hours, and there's also the question of doing this in the evenings and at weekends if we're thinking about offices to start with. Adaptable assets operate over a slightly longer term. So here we adopt Stuart Brand, I mentioned him earlier, his model of the six S's, the 6 shearing layers of a building that change at different speeds at a time. The S's are structure, skin, services, space plan, and stuff. Site is the 6th, but that's it, unchanging, and we're not addressing it directly. And the model directly, consciously splits the ownership of those different building layers between those which can last a long time, are perpetual and durable, and can address multiple functions of a building, and those which are actually function specific. So let's take an investor who wants a long-term reasonable return, moderate return, low risk investment. They can invest in the structure and the skin. A shorter term investor looking for a higher return in a more volatile environment can come in and fit out the function specific elements like the services, the space plan, and the furniture, the staff. And we can have a fully tenanted building for a lease period, say 10 years, 15 years. However, we are seeing trends change, pandemics come, expectations are not constant. And so the long-term investor can continue to get value from the asset, from their skin and their structure, if they are then with great ease and speed are able to get a different investor with a different business model, a different social function to come in and provide a different set of layers to that space. Say an office building currently now unoccupied due to COVID could become something else like a residential building or a hotel, with a different space plan, different servicing strategy, and different fit out. And that would then protect the value of the structure and the skin in a way that avoids the demolition moment that would have happened otherwise if that fallen office demand had perpetuated. This is obviously quite similar to some of the ways that offices are currently delivered. But what we are trying to be explicit here is that the way that most offices are delivered now assumes that there will be offices for a long time or for forever. And we're saying, do not assume that. Can you design a building, a structure and a skin of a building that could be an office as well as a hotel, as well as an apartment building, as well as anything else it might be? And that requires us to think carefully about how we do our core layouts, our floor to floor heights, our floor plate depths, and shapes and sizes and those kind of things. Relocatable buildings is our model for vacant land. So we're proposing a new actor in the value chain who owns a portfolio of relocatable buildings. These buildings they use the concept of design for deconstruction, which is at the heart of circular economy built environment thinking, to provide temporary buildings with a feel and quality of a permanent one. So you get the rent of a brand new building, a permanent building, but with a building that's actually very quick and easy and affordable to move if you need to. And you can deploy this portfolio of different buildings onto different vacant plots. So if a larger redevelopment regeneration project takes 10 years to get through planning, you can get your building down there for 7 years, generating rent and social amenity for the local community, while that longer process runs, and avoids that site being vacant for that 10-year period. And then those buildings get deployed onto another plot, another plot, another plot, and they continue to generate revenue. And we're seeing models like this already appearing for, like, there's a provider of school buildings in Finland, for example, that provides a sort of a model on this basis, that wherever there is demand for schools, they're able to move schools around to service different communities over a reasonable time period. The residual value model, this is perhaps one of our more challenging conceptual ones. It sort of says it takes more money to design a building than build a building for deconstruction. So how does the developer, the original builder, get the cash flow to pay for that? Well, we say that they will sell a new contract, a futures contract, the value of which is tied to the value of the materials in their building. This contract can then be traded on an exchange while those materials are in that building. The materials, of course, will come out at different times, depending on whether they're in the services, might come out after 15 or 20 years, versus the facade that might come out a little bit later. But as with anything that has value that changes over time, can be traded and profits can be made on it, as per sort of commodities trading or futures trading on exchanges already. And at the moment of deconstruction, whoever owns that piece of paper, that futures contract, is able to claim the value of the materials in the building. And that eliminates, overcomes that accountancy challenge I talked about earlier, that assumes materials are depreciated to zero over their service life, thereby protecting the value of the materials in the asset. And finally, performance procurement. There's a concept in circular economy thinking called product as a service, that's sort of suggesting that the supply chain should move away from selling products to selling services. And the best example of this so far is Philips Signify Paperlux lighting. It started off as an experiment in an architect's office in the Netherlands, where the architect said, I don't want to buy light bulbs, I want to buy light. And I will enter into a subscription with you, a service agreement with you, where you will provide me light and you will retain ownership. So Philips Signify, you will retain ownership of the lighting system, you will run it for me, you will optimize it for energy use, and then when I don't need it anymore, you will take it back and you will supply it to somebody else. So that model incentivizes the supplier to make products that last as long as possible and can be reused, as opposed to as cheaply as possible to sell as many as they can. And we can sort of apply this model to the different layers of the building, and run it in using IoT sensors, so that there's feedback to the providers of the services who've retained ownership of those systems, so that they can be billed on their performance. So if the building is using more energy than it should, then there is a financial pain for the supplier there, and they are incentivized to diagnose the fault and get that building performing as it should be as quickly as possible. And that overcomes the challenge that we have of underperforming buildings. So for each of those 5 models, as I mentioned earlier, we took real commercial data from real projects, and we put that information into a discounted cash flow model. This is a representation of the discounted cash flow model of a build to rent building. Income is at the top, costs are at the bottom. And then we reimagined those cash flows using our circular models, rewired them according to the value that we believed we'd captured, the value that we believed we'd added. And we calculated for each of the 5 what the improved return would be. And here we can see that, for example, each of the 5 models was modeled in a different city. It was modeled in a different, we call these test bed projects. It was modeled in a different asset type. So we can see commercial, residential, mixed use, tenanted retail, and build to rent residential in there being modeled. And in each case, we were able to demonstrate an improved performance. So for the tenanted office in Milan for flexible spaces, they developed, the extra revenue they're able to generate filling their under occupied office represented an 18% reduction in the total costs to the anchor tenant of occupying that space. So 18%, nearly 20% of the rent that they were paying, they were able to recover through the flexible space model, which is pretty significant. On the adaptable assets, a much longer term model, as we talked about more steady return, we had a 3% increase on return. So not just 3% return, but a 3% increase on what a linear model would have been, assuming some change of use during that 50-year period. The relocatable building model has a pretty hefty benefit of 26%. That does not include land cost, because land cost is so sensitive to postcode, which side of the street you're on, never mind which city you're in. We did not include that in the cash flow. But what we can say is that 26% is such a hefty improvement in your return, or such a hefty, significant return to the relocatable building portfolio owner, that they could easily negotiate a suitable land cost that fits within that profit envelope and still gives them a decent return. And that would be acceptable to their business plan. The residual value model here shows a 5% improvement for a tenant on their fit out materials over 10 years, which is a pretty good return for what's a pretty narrow margin industry in terms of retail fit out. And the performance procurement provided, again, a sort of a 3% improvement in return over 30 years, which again, over a medium long-term investment, is a pretty good improvement for what would be a stable, low return investment anyway. So what is clear from this approach, we think, is that while we might start looking at circular economy as designers, as a design strategy, looking to reduce resource consumption, reduce costs, or extend the life of our assets and our materials through design for deconstruction, our specifications, durability, that kind of thing. What we also need to bring to the table is some element of business strategy. In the performance procurement model, we bought the materials were the same, but they were bought differently, and that led to a different set of behaviors that gave an improved return. And so if we bring the business strategy lens to it, we can keep assets in use for higher value, we can improve competitive position, and we can deliver the systemic change that we need. So we need to conclude then that circular economy is a cohesive strategy that brings together both the design community and the real estate, the business community, the supply chain community together in a series of strategies that create win-wins for everybody, as well as delivering on our environmental objectives around eliminating waste and decarbonization. So that second section is maybe a little quick, but we have, I think, 10 minutes, just over 10 minutes for questions. So really interested to hear your thoughts on that and have a bit of a discussion.
Yes, we do have a few questions in the Q&A box. So let's start with this one. How has COVID accelerated the shift to flexible space? Many companies that went to work from home have found they need significantly less office space as they return to more normal operations. Also, even before COVID, with the retail apocalypse meant it was getting harder and harder to rent first floor commercial spaces. Add the collapse of the restaurant industry and it's even worse.
Yeah, so I think there's 2 points I can sort of respond there. The first is our concept, our model of adaptable assets was really another way of thinking about it is that it's an insurance policy. So every building is built on an assumed business model, an assumed use, and assumed demand. There are lots of shocks out there, like pandemics. There are lots of stresses out there, like inequality and changing climate, that impact the demand and impact that business model. And you never know, or we said it when we created the model last year, you never know when one of those is going to come along and flip your demand. Little did we anticipate that as we were publishing this work in February of this year, there was such a sort of an enormous and a really challenging and difficult for us shock coming along. So yeah, COVID is going to impact it, of course. There are lots of big occupiers out there looking at their expenses, looking at their rental costs and thinking, if I can get away with having 20% of my workforce at home most of the time, why am I paying for this office space? What I can't answer is the degree to which that impact is going to sort of be perpetual and how much of it's going to bounce back. And that's if I could, I would be doing pretty well, because it's whether it's 60% reduction in demand, 40% reduction in demand, 20% reduction in demand, being able to answer that question would be worth a lot of money. So I think, yeah, the concept is there. It's designed to protect the value of assets when these shocks and stresses come along. The extent to which it's going to embed and stick around is difficult to see, but there will be some impact for sure, we think.
Thank you. So we have another question. When everything is SaaS, software as a service, I think that is, it adds the risk of the health of the provider company. What happens if they go bankrupt or are sold during the life of the building?
Yeah, this is an interesting question too. So there is, yeah, one thought is that if you these are valuable assets and these are valuable cash flows. So if I have a building with a service agreement associated with it, if the person providing that service agreement goes bust, that cash flow still has value. That tenant still needs that service, and so along with any other asset, I guess, if they go bust, if a built company goes bust, that can be sold and can be bought by a competitor, and that system can be taken over. One of the early adopters of this model is Kaer, K-A-E-R, air conditioning and HVAC company based in Singapore. And they run air conditioning as a service. They will for a monthly fee, they will provide you chilled water in your building and retain ownership of the plant. But they also, as I understand it, take over other companies' systems. So you don't have to have a Kaer plant system in your building to be able to buy Kaer air conditioning, chilled water as a service. And so there are ways of sort of, even with non-standard equipment, you can retrofit this subscription model into different systems. So I think that because there's value there, there will be a way around sort of bankruptcies and things, just as there is now with administration processes.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I'll ask another of my questions while we wait for a few more to come into the Q&A box. What kinds of policies can cities or local governments implement to support the development of circular economies?
Yeah, I mean, that's another good question. We're seeing increasingly an increasing amount of activity from policymakers and governments on this. So an example close to home for me is London. The new London plan has just come in from the Greater London Authority, which requires all referable projects, so all projects above a certain size, to provide a circular economy statement as part of their planning submission. So that statement, there's guidance that's just been published, which outlines what that statement has got to say. And it has a flow chart that leads the design team through a process of assessing what assets you've got on site. If you have an existing building, can you retain it? If you can't retain it, justify why you can't retain it. If you are building new, how are you sourcing your materials? How are you specifying those materials? And any materials that are going off site as a waste, how are you managing those at the highest possible value, not just diverting them from landfill, but trying to find reuse, remanufacturing opportunities for those materials. So that's a pretty sort of systematic process that London's just introduced. Amsterdam as well has built a model for the city, a future plan for the city based on circular economy and donut economics from Kate Raworth. The Dutch government has a circular economy law requiring the economy to be 100% circular by 2050. I think they're still working out what 100% circular means, but it has prompted lots of Dutch companies, lots of Dutch developers and Dutch municipalities like Amsterdam to take action to map the flows of resources through their cities, attach a value to those, trying to quantify the amount of value that's lost through materials being depreciated or buildings being prematurely demolished, and trying to sort of match startups, match firms, match entrepreneurs with those value opportunities to create businesses that are needed to capture some of that value.
Thank you. Let's end on this one. As an engineer, are there upcoming or current material innovations or other technological innovations that you find encouraging or inspiring for the future of circular economies in the built environment?
Yeah, I do. I think, well, I come out of a structural engineering background and an embodied carbon background. And so for me, engineered timber has been sort of on the agenda and rising up the agenda for 10 years now, my entire career. I should say, given the region that we're in Australia, I think Lend-Lease made an announcement recently about big investments and a shift towards sort of cross-laminated timber for lots of their projects in Australia. So that's an interesting one to watch. Should also mention in the previous point that the Victorian government with their infrastructure authority, also has a sort of recycle first program going on, which Arup is helping them with, which is seeking to maximize the use of recycled materials in some of their projects. So, you know, across around globally, we're seeing sort of an adoption of these things. Now, engineered timber is most readily available in Central Europe and the Pacific Northwest in North America. So it's by no means kind of a universally available material, but we are seeing startups. We're seeing activity in Australia, we're seeing activity in South Africa where this technology is growing. And the more clients that ask for it, the more design teams explore it and what they can do with it, then the more demand and the more growth we'll see with that material, which would be interesting. I've just seen another question come in from Jay Ginsberg about working from home. Do we see the emergence of new kinds of neighborhood scale flexible buildings? People are moving to suburbs in search of extra bedroom for office space. We see a couple of concepts around, I guess, for again, working on the sort of the flexible office space, the flexible workspace concept, where you take sort of short-term leases or short-term available on particular spaces. I can't say I've yet seen, but I'd be very interested to see new briefs coming out for different kinds of buildings. So you could imagine that buildings with on-site shared working spaces, as well as residential, as well as retail, as well as catering, you know, keeping things a lot more local and avoiding that travel, that commute could be a lot more popular. Anecdotally, I have heard in London that some new buildings which do have sort of on-site working facilities were previously empty and they're now packed, and people are avoiding that kind of travel. So I'd be interested to anecdotally, yes, but not on real projects. I'd be interested to see more if anyone else has examples to share.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I've put the links to both of Arup's circular economy reports in the chat. So any attendees who are interested can click on those, and we'll post the session recording on our YouTube channel, along with the translation, the simultaneous interpretation in Mandarin Chinese. Thank you so much, Richard. It's really been wonderful to be part of these conversations, and I am looking forward to hearing and reading more.
No, at all. Thanks, Natasha. Thanks, everyone. Good to talk to you today.